Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Tonight we begin with two developments and tie them into a bigger problem. Iran is claiming a fire and possible explosion at its nuclear plant in Natanz was likely caused by a cyber attack. Tehran is threatening retaliation in response. While rumors were circulating about such an incident, now Iran's Atomic Energy Organization has confirmed that there has been some damage to an overground facility at Natanz. This is the same nuclear site which was also cyber-attacked in 2010 by US and Israel. The attack destroyed some 1,000 centrifuges and set the Iranian nuclear program back by many years. Meanwhile, Britain is planning to begin phasing out the use of Huawei's technology in Britain's 5G network as soon as this year. Reason? The UK's government communications headquarters, known as GCHQ, and responsible for signal intelligence and information assurance, has raised new security fears over Chinese technology. Two different stories? Not really. What ties them together is what we plan to discuss: the digital world, its conveniences, and its vulnerabilities. So let's dive right into it and get to our experts. We are joined by Pierluigi Paganini, who is an analyst and founder of Security Affairs and Sybase SPA. And we also have with us Philip Ingram, who specializes and writes about things concerning intelligence, security, and cyber. Thank you to both the panelists. Let me begin with Mr. Paganini here. Mr. Paganini, what do you, as I said, these are two different stories, but it's the same digital world. Now, we have been into this world for a fairly long time now. It's not new, but the advances are bringing in new technologies and new counter technologies. So just give us an overview of how you look at what Tehran is saying, and then we move on to the more general side of things.
Yeah, first of all, consider that almost every government is investing in the development of cyber capabilities and is working on the design of new powerful cyber weapons. A cyber attack could have the same effect of a conventional military attack, especially when it targets critical infrastructure. Let's think, for example, to telecommunication systems, nuclear plant, hospital, defense system. It could be used to cause a fire or an explosion inside a production plant. A cyber weapon is a software that is specifically developed to target a system and alter its behavior. This could have a dramatic effects if the system hit by the attack is the control system inside a water facility or a telecommunication system or electronic grid. As you said, anyway, we have two stories, but the same battlefield, that is the cyberspace. Today, everything is passing on the cyberspace, and 5G is considered the infrastructure of this new domain. So it's important to understand.
Mr. Paganini, we are going to go there, but let me go back a little. Now, as you know, being an expert, that generally very sensitive facilities are air-gapped. Now, if they are, then how do you, unless, like the last time in 2010, when there was the Stuxnet attack at Natanz, a particular thumb drive was actually physically taken in. Now, how do you attack facilities which are air-gapped?
Basically, there are different means to attack air-gapped networks. The most common is to leverage on human beings. For example, use a USB sticks, leave the sticks, for example, in a US dongle, leave the dongle in the area nearby of the plant, and someone inside the infrastructure could take this key and insert in a PC that is air-gapped, and from them you can have a lateral movement until the malware, the cyber weapon, will localize the target, and we start the procedure to destroy the operation or to spy on the infected system. But anyway, there are many other means that are more sophisticated. You can use, for example, laser. You can use, for example, the header of the PC. You can listen, for example, the rumor that is emitted by, for example, the hard disk of a system. Anyway, you need to compromise the physical access to the system that usually is reached through the human beings.
Okay, stay with me, Mr. Paganini. Hop over to Philip Ingram. Mr. Ingram, give me a sense of how you look at it and some of the things that Mr. Paganini has talked about, because I'm just trying to understand on the basis of the assumption, and I think that assumption is fair to make, that very sensitive installations, whether nuclear plants, other installations, are also defended it's got to have some kind of layered digital defense in order to stop an external attack. So tell us how this works.
After the 2010 Stuxnet attack, Iran increased its cyber defensive capability and offensive capability dramatically. And therefore, it will have increased the number of procedures that it has in place to stop external threats being brought in to bridge that air gap, as you so eloquently brought out. And it's clear that if this is, and it hasn't been confirmed yet, another cyber attack, or the damage has been caused by another cyber attack, then it's a clear breach of that air gap. But it also shows the vulnerability of these sort of strategic capabilities that are out there. And those vulnerabilities could be attacked through cyber or through physical. There was a report went out to BBC Middle East just before that, or BBC Persia, just before this happened, saying that a dissident group had got in and planted some form of device in there. Now, those devices could have been cyber devices, or they could have been conventional explosive devices. But it is another security embarrassment for the Italians. And it highlights how the importance of our interconnected world and security in our interconnected world and people understanding their wider digital exposure is. And with 5G coming in, and I know we're going to talk about that, that will just increase that potential exposure dramatically.
Okay, so one of the things that experts talk about, and I think they're concerned about, in terms of the intranets within these sensitive installations, are actually the cell phones of the employees that get connected to the net, and generally there is a sense that it is through those phones that someone can get in and exploit. So how does that work?
Well, it could be through their phones. It could be through any Internet of Thing connected device. A lot of people are walking around, and I'm holding my wrist up here with a GPS fitness tracker that's on there. There are so many different ways and devices that you can use to get into a network. And if the network is run over wireless means inside the factory, again, you can sit outside in a vehicle, as we saw with some GRU agents from Russia sitting outside the OPCW after the Sergei Skripal attack 2 years ago, trying to hack into the OPCW web Wi-Fi network to access things that are in there. It is relatively straightforward if you've got the right knowledge and the right equipment to break into a network, especially if it's wireless. That's the threat that comes in with 5G. If it's hardwired, it's much more difficult. But the original 2010 Stuxnet attack showed the power of running a cyber attack, but using a human capability beforehand. And there'll have been a human intelligence operation run to get those USB sticks into the right place, to the right hands at the right time. And it's very sophisticated. It takes a lot of research. And if it happened beforehand, human vulnerabilities can be exploited yet again. And that may have happened on this occasion.
Absolutely, as there's nothing is foolproof. For every proof, there's always a fool. But let me go back to Mr. Paganini here. Mr. Paganini, as I said, let's talk about the 5G thing. GCHQ, we know that the US has already put in sanctions on Huawei. But one of the reports said something interesting, and I'm quoting from that. This report was prepared by GCHQ's National Cybersecurity Center, and it concludes that new US sanctions on Huawei will force the company to use untrusted technology that could make the risk impossible to control. Now, what does this mean? I mean, Huawei, does this mean that Huawei, instead of using the US chips, is going to get the chips from somewhere else? Just explain this to us.
Yeah. Basically, this means that Western intelligence agency fears that Chinese company that produce 5G equipment like Huawei or ZTE could operate for their government to spy on communication. This could be done, for example, by introducing stealth backdoors. They fear the presence of hidden backdoors that could allow the Chinese government to remotely control the equipment with an impact on the entire communication network infrastructure. US is pushing its allies like UK, Canada, New Zealand, and UK to ban China's equipment from 5G networks. And in this sense, as you say, the British intelligence agency has prepared a specific report to highlight the risk related to use China's equipment. But basically, they are referencing the possibility that China's government has inserted hidden backdoors.
Okay. So if not Huawei, who else is catching up with Huawei as far as 5G technology is concerned? Is there any other company that's actually where the Huawei is?
Well, I can tell you that the China's government probably is the most advanced in development of 5G networks, but there are also other governments. US itself has developed its 5G program. I can tell you from the most advanced countries in terms of cyber capability that probably who is a step behind in this moment is Russia, but any other government, US, UK, and are able to provide 5G network appliance. The problem is also the cost. You have to consider that in many cases, 5G networks, 5G equipments produced by China's organization, by Chinese companies is less expensive. So this is what this is the main advantage in use China's equipment right now.
Okay. Mr. Ing, is this just about the cost, or is it also about the level of technology that Huawei brings to the table?
Well, and it's about politics as well. This is
indeed.
nothing new.
Absolutely.
This is nothing new. The UK Intelligence and Security Committee raised concerns about Huawei's involvement in our 3G and 4G networks in 2009. In 2010, Huawei then opened a research centre that it funds, but it is staffed completely by UK security-cleared personnel, ex of GCHQ and NCSC, to take Huawei's equipment apart, look for vulnerabilities, hardware backdoors and software backdoors. It's got access to Huawei source code in it, and only Huawei staff can only get in if they're properly escorted. So that was to bring confidence back into the Huawei hardware that's out in the networks that was starting to be stripped out by UK's British Telecom. However, what has happened in this case is, and that organisation is called the Cell and is based in Cambridgeshire. What's happened in this case is US sanctions, which is a political trade war against China, has forced China to change some of the electronics and chipset suppliers that it's putting into its equipments. And those suppliers are not as reliable as the ones that they've been using beforehand, and therefore guaranteeing the security of those chips that are going into the devices cannot be done in the same way. And part of the issue is, when it comes to the economics that there is the Huawei equipment is produced very cost effectively, very cheaply. That means that the general engineering that's inside it is not of a high quality. And on the chips, whenever they get to final development stage, there are what are called developers' backdoors that should be closed down before they go into production. But that puts another step in the process that costs money. So often with a lot of cheap electronics that are coming out, and Internet of Things devices are like this, those developers' backdoors are left wide open, and they can then be exploited either by governments, criminal organizations, or other hackers from other sources. And that's the concern that there is here.
Okay. Quickly, one question which I'll also take to Mr. Paganini before I close this segment. Now, lots of these new military platforms have massive digital content, and also the entire sort of, what we now call the integrated, military things. Now, if state X is purchasing this equipment from state Y, in theory, or in practice perhaps, and that's where I want to get your response, that the seller could actually create, or hardwire those backdoors, which then it could exploit even as state Y is actually using that equipment. Is this correct? Is this sequence possible?
When encryption first came out from the United States, there were two standards. There was the standard that they kept inside the US, which was much higher than the standard that they allowed and licensed to be sold across the globe, which was of a lower standard, and they knew the US intelligence agencies could break it. Hardwired backdoors are one possibility, but there's a greater chance that the backdoors are going to be more in the software that's there. That gives greater potential for vulnerabilities. And as software is continuously being updated by the manufacturers to keep it up to the right level, that's the easier way of inserting backdoors in the future. So is it likely to happen? Oh, yes.
Okay, great. Mr. Paganini, so it's likely to happen. We're entering a very strange world, a world that you understand, a world where people like me use these devices, but we don't have any idea what these devices, how these devices are vulnerable, and what we can do to stop that vulnerability.
Yeah, basically nothing is secure. I always say that security is, let me say, a concept that is related to a specific moment. What is secure right now is no more secure from 5 seconds right now, because someone could find a vulnerability and could exploit it in a cyber attacks. So we have considered that it's very important to analyze any device that we are using, and it's very important the other hardware and software qualification of any equipment.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It was very enlightening. Pierluigi, Paganini, Philip Ingram, talking to us about this new digital world. Well, it's not new, as I said, but emerging technologies and the rest of it. They also bring conveniences and major vulnerabilities. Anyway, we shall take a short break here and return to discuss Tehran's decision to file a lawsuit in the International Court of Justice against the US over its sanctions effects in handling the COVID-19 crisis. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. We move on to Iran's decision to file a lawsuit against the US in the International Court of Justice. Iran says the US sanctions have negatively impacted its ability to handle the COVID-19 crisis. The decision comes in the wake of refusal by President Donald Trump's administration to remove sanctions on Iran, even as Tehran battles the deadly virus while its economy reels under the pressure of sanctions. Speaking in Tehran, Presidential Aide for Legal Affairs announced the decision, saying Washington's curbs are against human rights. Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif says the US has targeted Iran's interests in the region, and Washington's anti-Iran measures aim to cause a rift between Tehran and its public. To discuss this further, we are joined by Mostafa Khoschcheshm. Mr. Khoschcheshm is an academic, a journalist. He has taught at a number of Iranian universities and also at the International Relations faculty of the Iranian Foreign Ministry. We also have with us Professor Kaunert, who is Chair of Policing and Security, as well as Director of the International Center for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. Let me begin with Mr. Khoschcheshm. Mr. Khoschcheshm, the US does not really accept the jurisdiction of the ICJ, although it is bound through various treaties, and those treaties have clauses that allow for ICJ jurisdiction. But this is not the first time, if I remember correctly, for Iran to try to take something to the ICJ. Correct me if I am wrong, but I think in 2018 also Iran tried that.
You know, according to international rules and regulations, when hostile actions taken by a nation against the second nation, this targeted nation could file a lawsuit at the International Court of Justice. And as soon as the court comes up with a decision that it's qualified to deal with the problem, it could issue a ruling to put that action under discussion on hold until further, court sessions and a final verdict. And this, in the last case, it happened, but not completely. As a matter of fact, when Iran filed a complaint against all U.S. sanctions, the court issued an initial ruling ordering the United States to stop its sanctions against only humanitarian goods, that's food and also medicine. Since then, and of course, that was not a complete decision. Let's remember that it was somehow a move to appease both sides, because they should have issued a ruling for the United States to put on hold all its sanctions, especially considering that they are unilateral sanctions happening outside the UN Security Council and Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. So they are not legal per se, and they should actually be punished by the UN community, especially because UN Resolution 2231. But still, the U.S. has rejected and has been adamant to compliance with the ICJ ruling. They have not been providing Iran with access to banking transactions that should be there for any kind of transaction, including import of food supplies and medical supplies. They had rather done something to show that they are making some small moves, like saying that all the pharmaceutical companies that want to work with Iran, they should bring up all their, accounts, all the history and records of their deals with Iran and with the Iranian parties to the United States and to the U.S. State Department and Treasury to make sure that the drugs and medical supplies would not eventually end up in the hands of sanctioned Iranian entities. And this way, many pharmaceutical companies have been shooed away because they do not want to reveal their, accounts to a foreign party, to a state party, and they know that deep down the United States will eventually find something to, threaten them, to impose sanction on them, and they will eventually find something in their records of the past years. So they have remained reluctant to work with Iran. In this way, they are not allowing Iran to import pharmaceutical and food supplies. And people have been dying, not because of coronavirus, but because of many other diseases that require foreign medical supplies, and they are under sanctions, and Tehran cannot supply such medical supplies for the country, for the nation.
Okay. I will obviously run with some more questions, but stay with me, Mr. Khoschcheshm. Let me go to Professor Kaunert here. Professor Kaunert, there's obviously the geopolitics of the entire thing, and as I said in my opening, Foreign Minister Javad Zarif's statement is very important when he says that these anti-Iran measures aim to cause a rift between Tehran and its public. Now, it's been quite evident for a fairly long time that one of the things that the US does want to do is to somehow get the Iranian public to overturn the current Iranian power configuration. And I think most of this is directed towards that.
I think there is, of course, a larger geopolitical consideration. I think that is without a doubt. And of course, the United States is unhappy with Iranian leadership. I think they've made that very clear. That's why they also pulled out of the treaty with Iran. But I think what is happening here is a little bit more than what you've just described. There is an element of being unhappy with the leadership, and therefore possibly there may be some truth in terms of wanting to create a rift between the public and the leadership. But I think the larger concern is, of course, the Iranians' march towards a nuclear bomb. And I think that is a very real concern. Now, the international community has been in two minds about how to tackle that issue. Certainly, in terms of the European response has been, well, we have to bring Iran in and have this kind of treaty in order to keep Iran within that kind of framework, whereas the American response post-Obama. So the Trump response has been that that treaty is not worth it. So in a sense, the relationship has become more antagonistic from the Obama presidency to the Trump presidency. But the larger concern about Iran's march towards a nuclear bomb is shared by everybody in the international community. And that is just a way of how to respond to this, where the Europeans and the Americans are differing. And in fact, even the Russians and the Chinese have been quite clear that they also don't want Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. So it has to be seen in this larger geopolitical.
But Professor Kaunert, was UN-sanctioned a multilateral arrangement, the JCPOA, which was aimed precisely at ensuring that Iran does not weaponize its nuclear potential. Now, Iran was completely in compliance with that treaty. That has been certified by the IAEA inspectors. That has also been certified by the European governments who were part of the JCPOA arrangement. As a matter of fact, the US walked out of that treaty, not because Iran was not in compliance, but because, as per the Trump administration, America wants the Iranian, to stop the Iranian power projection in the greater Middle East. America wants the current Iranian power configuration to unravel. And these were issues that were completely outside of the framework of the JCPOA.
Yes, as you rightly point out, there is a very serious difference in terms of opinion between the European governments who, as you rightly point out, confirmed that Iran is complying, but they only confirmed it until the moment that Iran also withdrew from some of the obligations from the treaty, which of course, since then, Iran has no longer been compliant. They were until the moment that the US withdrew, as you rightly say, but from the moment that the US withdrew, Iran has also not been compliant anymore.
No, but I agree with you, but Iran said that, Iran obviously, like every other state, was going to respond to this, and they said and kept saying to the European states within the agreement that you need to ensure that the sanctions do not hurt us, otherwise we will begin to gradually walk back on this. And that's what they're doing. So I think it's very different from, in this particular case, Iran, to me, does not seem to be the party that began the process of unraveling of JCPOA.
Yes and no. It depends where you put the beginning of that story, because, of course, the reason that the treaty was there to begin with was that Iran was seen to be not complying with the nuclear proliferation treaty. If they had been seen to be complying with that treaty, in a sense, there wouldn't have been a need for that second treaty. So in that sense, it does start with Iran's initial interest in developing nuclear weapons and the international community's fear that, in fact, they are going to achieve reaching nuclear weapons. And that's what the second treaty then dealt with. Now, I fully agree with you. Between the Obama administration and the Trump administration, we had a very, very significant change of policy. And in fact, Iran could very well be holding out. Now, there's only a couple of months until the next US election, and we might have a shift back to the kind of pre-Trumpian position that the United States is going to take with the Biden administration. You might very well find that, in fact, with a new US administration, you might get a return to the US policy prior. But all of that rests, in a sense, on the assumption that Iran is going to behave during that time period. If they are going to take steps that cannot be reversed anymore, a future Biden administration will be forced to kind of continue the stance of current President Trump, because they will no longer have the option of returning to the pre-negotiation period.
Okay, thank you. That was Professor Christian Kaunert speaking with us. Let me go back to Mr. Khoschcheshm. Mr. Khoschcheshm, as I said, and it's very clear from what Professor Kaunert was saying, that there are lots of things getting conflated here. And I think that is something that needs to be understood very clearly, that Iran is asking for a relief in order to deal with a medical crisis. If we throw in other things into this, then it becomes complicated. Is my sense, or is this approach that I'm talking about something that you would agree with?
Well, first of all, there were some claims raised here. Let me correct these claims first. First of all, Iran has been under the monitoring of the IAEA. There have been thousands of man-hours of inspections before the JCPOA was held, and they had never found even a shred of evidence to accuse Iran of any kind of wrongdoing or any possibility in that regard. Ever since the JCPOA, Iran has been under the harshest ever imposed regime of inspections by the IAEA that has verified Iran's full compliance with the JCPOA in 14 reports. Now, the United States withdrew from the JCPOA in May 2018. Iran stood in full compliance, and I emphasize that, in full compliance for 14 months. After it received nothing but words from the Europeans, it started modifying its undertakings under the nuclear deal. The deal undertakings on the side of Iran include three main areas of inspections and surveillance, as well as R&D and enrichment and Iraq heavy water reactor. Iran has modified two-thirds, but the most important part, which is inspections and the IAEA surveillance, it is still in place. Iran is still fully complying with the JCPOA inspections. After 14 months that it received nothing in return, it started modifying. So it was a late move. It was under much criticism by the domestic political groups as well as the people for not making a move. After 14 months, they started these reduction in undertakings. But more importantly, Iran's nuclear capability doesn't matter to the United States at all. Otherwise, they would have stuck to the nuclear deal because the JCPOA provided them with the harshest ever imposed regime of inspections on any nation. That includes thousands of uncalled visits to various Iranian sites, including Iranian universities, where there is some research about nuclear science. So Iran has stood in compliance and is still in compliance while it's not receiving anything. Basically, Iran did all these things for just one thing. That was removal of the sanctions. It never happened, even under the Obama administration. In that regard, there is no difference between Trump and Obama because neither one removed the sanctions. More importantly, the United States' ultimate goal is not containing Iran's power, but their main strategy is containing Iran's power components in various areas of nuclear industry, missile industry, regional power, and then the list would continue, of course, after they get the merits from Iran, if they can, in these areas. They would continue with drone technology, nanotechnology, and laser technology, and many other areas of science and technology.
Absolutely.
In order to wear off Iran's power, contain it to the geographical borders. And then when Iran is so weak, then it doesn't take much for the U.S. to topple the Islamic Republic, and it would keep the sanctions until the Iranian people, revolt against the government. If the Iranian government's strategy, if the system's strategy is just hoping on removing the sanctions through giving up Iran's power components, eventually it would remain under sanctions for many decades to come, and then it would have nothing. That's why Iran has shifted the strategy to work on developing ties with the regional nations, China, Russia, and many others, as well as developing Iranian economy. And it says it's not willing to talk to the United States because it now knows the rules of the games and how the U.S. is playing this game.
Okay. Just before I close, let me go to Lyal S. Sunga, who's an international law expert, who has joined us. Sunga, we're talking about Iran's decision to, invoke the ICJ with reference to U.S. sanctions that are obviously making it very difficult for Iran to fight the COVID crisis. What do you make of this in terms of international law?
Well, I think it's a very good move by by the Islamic Republic of Iran to try to solve this, issue through the peaceful settlement of disputes mechanism that you have at the United Nations. That's what the ICJ is there. And not only that, but the fact is that Iran already took United States before the ICJ back in July 2018, and the International Court of Justice held that Iran was asking for basically that the provisions of the 1955 Treaty of Amity, basically a friendship between the United States and Iran, prohibits the United States, or both parties actually, from engaging in taking any measures that limit trade and economic ties and imposing financial hardship. Now, these sanctions exactly are designed to do that, and it breaches, probably, said Iran, this treaty. And the ICJ didn't give exactly what Iran was asking for, but it actually made very clear that the United States' sanctions that affect medicine and medical equipment is in violation of this treaty. In other words, it's the legal obligations, it's treaty obligations, and actually made a provisional order back in October 3rd, 2018, that the U.S. should refrain from doing that. So Iran has already won. This was even before COVID. So Iran already has won on that score in principle, but the United States has not, the Trump administration has not complied with the International Court of Justice's provisional order, which is a very serious matter. So, if the U.S. administration wants to invoke international law, it should first, abide by its own treaty obligations to Iran, because that treaty is still in force, notwithstanding Secretary of State Pompeo's noises that, we're going to withdraw from it. But that's not clear whether the White House has the power to do that, and that's a legally unclear situation of whether you need congressional approval or not. So I think it's pretty clear that one can never be too sure, how a judgment will go, but it's already had a ruling in favor. So anything that affects humanitarian supplies, and that's what these are, or foodstuffs or medical equipment, this should be contrary to international law, and specifically this 1955 Treaty of Amity between the United States and Iran.
Absolutely. I was talking to Mr. Khoschcheshm about this particular ICJ, provisional verdict. But before I wrap up, Mr. Sunga, just give me a sense of, so Iran's invocation of the ICJ now is something that Iran wants to build on the precedent already there at the ICJ. It seems to me that that is the case. But if the U.S. did not comply with that provisional order of the ICJ in 2018, how does Iran expect that it could pull that off now?
Well, you're right, it's a problem, and that has to do with the weakness of international laws. The ICJ cannot enforce its judgments except through the Security Council. The United States has a veto there. And so what it does do is it serves to show even more that the United States position is really, really out there. It's isolated. The EU doesn't support it. And there's been this letter on 6 April 2020 from 4 former NATO secretaries general. There was Madeleine Albright, all top diplomats, pleading the Trump administration to cease and desist from these sanctions, which are hurting the humanitarian situation of the Iranian people. And, the United States has already managed to isolate itself from, by, first of all, withdrawing from the JCPOA in the first place, but then taking harsher measures and, reimposing the sanctions, which had been lifted from the GCPOA, and then doubling down more recently. So just a final note, maybe I would say, is that on the other hand, the Iranian government probably also senses that Trump may not win the next election, and it's getting a little bit more assertive. Because Trump's political fortunes seem to be going down and down in every regard, because at least at the foreign policy level, there's been one blunder after another. So, that's also an open question there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lyal S. Sunga, speaking with us. Thank you also to Syed Mostafa Khoschcheshm for his insights. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.